I'd spent 40 years in misery. And that's when I started to understand about how our beliefs shape us, how our beliefs that we have about ourselves, about our world, whatever, really inform our actions.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, the self loathing and self hatred was completely unnecessary.
Hello, and welcome to the Big 4-0 podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie McLaughlin. In our 20s and 30s, we spend so much time and energy striving for success and checking all the boxes, but it's usually according to some outside authorities' standards or approval. Then, in the years around age 40, many of us start to redefine who we are, what success means, and what we want out of life. It's not always a smooth process. I fought against the transition, which made getting through it a messier process than it had to be. On this podcast, I welcome you to tap into my stories and experience, as well as those of my guests, to help you make your way through your own transition, and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes we made along the way. Today, my guest is Emily Hall, who burst into tears on her 40th birthday because she hadn't achieved all the things she thought she was supposed to by that milestone. After her fiancé's infidelity and subsequent life implosion, Emily faced her deep codependency issues and contemplated some drastic options. But today, she's going to tell us how she transformed her mindset and internal dialogue. Hi, Emily. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
It really is a pleasure. I love your story because it starts with bursting into tears on your 40th birthday,
Yeah.
proving that, it's not always the best. But before we get there, let's set the stage for how we got to that point. So tell me a little bit about your early life, the forces that shaped you, and how you got to the beginning of this transitional phase.
Gosh, I mean, early life, I didn't have the most normal childhood growing up, let's say. It was a very toxic environment at home, toxic environment at school, which led to lots of alcohol, drugs, binge eating, all of that, any kind of self-sabotaging behavior. You name it, I did it. I had no idea at the time that I was just trying to cover up all of this stuff. And then, partied my way through my 20s and 30s thinking that that's who I was.
Me too.
But actually, the real me is somebody who is very into her horses, into her dogs, into the country. Don't get me wrong, I love a drink still, but that kind of party. And then in my mid 30s, early 30s, I met a man and I kind of thought that this is it. We're going to get married, we're going to have children. But actually, that relationship in lots of ways was very good in the beginning. But later on, it was two people who didn't feel good enough that come together. And then I hit 40, I was still in that relationship. And the reason that I cried on my 40th, because I was like, oh my God, I'm still not married. I still don't have kids. And these are the things that we are told that we should have done,
Yes.
and it was always a kind of unsaid thing in my family that I was the kind of unmarried one. I think my mum really subtly, in a lot of subtle ways, sort of hinted that there was something wrong with me. I didn't have my first boyfriend until I was about 19. And it was certainly what's wrong with her? What's wrong with her? She hasn't got this boyfriend. So it was this theme. So that is exactly because I just thought, oh my God, my life's over. I'm 40. I'm not married. I haven't got any kids. This is it.
And did you know at the time, was that even what you wanted, or were you just following all the things that you thought you should be doing?
So it's definitely what I wanted, actually.
Okay, it was.
That
All
is
right, good.
true. But whether or not that's because the messaging had been so clear my entire life and I was kind of the odd one out in the family, who knows? I was certainly getting quite maternal at that point. But again, the messaging from my family had almost been, not my entire family, from a certain person in the family, was kind of like, oh, because I'd been in and out of hospital and I died a few times and all these different things happened, it was like, oh, Emily, would she ever be able to have children? And there was just all of this kind of stuff bubbling away. And maybe that's a reason that I just kept putting it off. And I don't know.
Can we back up 2 steps? Because you went by something at like 30 miles an hour that I think we need to hear a little more about. I died a couple of times?
So yeah, the first time I was in a coma, and then the second time a couple of years later, I had a blood clot and died like in the surgery. And then I had a near death experience a few years after that. And then a few years after that, I nearly died another time.
Oh my goodness, Emily. Wow. My jaws dropped. Holy cow. That's a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I just skim over it because it's just so normal to me now that
Yeah.
it just doesn't
I
even
can
seem like a thing.
Yeah, I can tell you, to me, it does not sound normal. How do you think those experiences affected you or shaped you as you were, I'm sensing that those were all before you were 40.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Everything before 40. It's interesting because I've never really thought that I wouldn't get over something. And I think that has got a lot to do with the belief system that on my mum's side, it was like the Halls, are always super, super ill. They're always in hospital, but no one ever dies. So I've always had this like massive belief that I'm just going to recover from something. So I think that kind of helped in a lot of ways. Did it massively change me? I mean, there was a lot of depression around some of that stuff. But then, again, was it those instances, or was it the low self esteem, the low confidence that I had in myself, the not valuing myself? A lot of that led to the kind of depression as well. So I don't think it's a kind of black and white answer. I mean, you hear some people say, they died and then they suddenly went skydiving and all that. Actually, I became more cautious. I definitely became more cautious. After the coma, I was petrified of flying, and I'd never been bothered about flying before. But it was just like, oh my God, I'm just going to die on a flight. And it was just because actually remember going into the coma and grabbing my mum's hand at the time and saying, "I know I'm going to die."
Oh,
And so that really, yeah, I just became a lot more cautious in some ways. In other ways, I think the drinking got worse. The drugs got worse. The eating got worse. So, you know,
yeah, yeah. The covering up of the things that you didn't wanna pay attention to or address or dig into, the sort of yeah, yeah, I
yeah, and I don't think I even knew how to be honest.
right,
And it was kind of like, okay, that's done. I'm out of hospital, let's get on with it. And I don't even think I even knew that I needed to address it. I was going to like counselors and stuff, but not really sort of, you know, digging into it. It was
yeah,
more talking about day by day stuff. So
right.
I just don't think, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think I processed any of it.
And meanwhile, if I remember correctly, your mom was a complicated person in your life as well, is that right?
Yeah, she is very, very complicated. But I think that comes from her own childhood, her own traumas, her own way of being.
Yeah,
She's
yeah.
still my mum. I still love her, and but I think a lot of the time we bring our trauma, and I certainly did in my life, to the relationships that we have around us. You know,
Right. Okay, so let's go back to this relationship you were in. You turned 40, you were upset that you hadn't achieved these milestones yet, and then he did ultimately propose, right?
Yes, yeah. And oh my God, Steph, it was like my world. It was the happiest day of my life.
Yeah.
Even though in the back of my mind, I was like, is this right? Because there was stuff going wrong in the relationship. But for me, it was like, I've made it.
Yeah.
It was like, this is it. I've made it. I'm engaged. That's it. That was the only thing that I saw in my life that was success, which is really sad when you think about it. Really sad.
Yeah. And that happiness, that joy of sort of achieving that milestone also ends up coming crashing down just a couple of months later, right?
Yeah, so then he had an affair and it broke me, of all the things that I'd been through. I remember one of my friends saying to me, "Look, you've been through worse." And she was talking about, the coma and stuff. And I just thought to myself, no, I haven't. I haven't been through worse because that idea that I'd lived with for 40 years, that I wasn't good enough to get married, no one would want me, that was all suddenly had become true, if you like. And it's just, I know better now, but back then I was just like, all this subconscious stuff was boiling away. And the only thing I could just see was pain. It was torture. And I remember saying to my friend, I said, look, I would go through any of those things. I would have the double pneumonia again. I would have the collapsed lungs. I would have any of that because I find that stuff easy to get through.
Well,
Whereas
I was
this,
just gonna say that all the medical stuff that you went through was physical,
yeah,
and you could deal with your physical body, but this was more emotional, and that was probably a more difficult place for you to dwell at the
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And, it was the one thing that I saw as success suddenly been ripped out from under me. Also, what I didn't realize then was that I was really codependent. I'd been codependent with my parents, I've been codependent in friendships, certainly codependent in my relationship. And then suddenly you've got that all ripped away, and lots of other things happened at the same time.
Mm,
My best friend went off to work for him, and she behaved very, very badly. And I was running his business. So I suddenly had no job. And then all this stuff happened. And it was just like, holy crap, this is just me now.
right.
I've got to do this, everything all on my own, which I'd had done until the point I met him. But suddenly it was just like, there's no best friend there for the codependency. There's no partner there for the codependency. My mother, some things happened there, that wasn't there. And I was just kind of like, holy fuck,
Yeah.
what am I
Yeah.
going to do? But at the time, not realizing that it was codependency that I was kind of like having this huge meltdown over, you
So
know.
tell me, because some of these therapeutic words are a little bit difficult for people who haven't heard them before to really
Yes.
understand. Tell me in your life, what does codependency look like? How does it manifest? Like you said a
Yeah.
couple of different ways. You said family, friends, and in your
Yes.
relationship. So tell us a little bit about that.
So growing up, I have always tried to be good enough and being that people pleaser, wanting people to like me. When you've got to earn love, when love comes with conditions, you learn that you've got to do certain things to get that love. In a codependent relationship, what happens is you give, and you attract someone toxic, and they take. And it's this weird, you're both kind of dependent on each other because they come from the same kind of scenario that they don't think they're good enough either, but their actions are different to my actions.
Yep. So they kind of
So
fit together
I
like puzzle pieces.
Yeah, exactly. So, lots of my friendships that I attracted in the past may have been quite selfish, and I would just give, abandon myself in the process and excuse a lot of the behavior in my relationship. Definitely excused a lot of the behavior, because I'm empathetic. So I would talk to myself about why he was behaving in the way that he did. But there comes a point where you've got to value yourself. And I just
Yeah.
did not value myself enough to call that behavior out because I was petrified that, he was going to leave. I was petrified that, my mum might never speak to me again or friends might go because I didn't want to be alone because, oh my God, that would just, bring up all this other stuff about how unlovable I am and how no one wants me. So all of this, subconscious stuff, but you don't realize it at the time. And then you just end up drinking 2 bottles of wine to kind of cover all of that shit up.
Yeah. To dull those voices in your head to quiet
Yeah.
them down. I remember when we first spoke, you said at the time you felt lucky to have him.
Oh God, totally and utterly. Yeah. It was like, I was the luckiest, like I'd won the lottery.
Right.
In fact, it was better than the lottery because someone loved me.
Right. Right.
And then when that was stripped away, it's like, oh, nobody loves me.
So when your life imploded and it took the boyfriend or the fiance, it took the best friend, it took your job, it took a lot of things
Mhm.
with it. You told me you thought through the options. Tell me what your options were at that point in time from your point of view at the time.
Yeah, so this is going to sound a bit, don't know what the word is, but the options for me really were, and I genuinely sat down and thought, look, what are my options here? I thought, number one, I can like keep doing the same thing. I'd spent years in and out of therapy and just not getting anywhere and just still feeling miserable. So that was like, do I carry on doing that? That isn't an option because, another 40, 50, 60 years of that, no way.
Mhm.
Option two, and this was a genuine option, was I could kill myself. And I'd already tried that, about a decade before, I think it was, and failed. Somebody, I was staying with a friend. She came home when she wasn't meant to. I ended up in hospital. And so I thought, I can't even do option two in case I fail again.
Right.
So I'm like, that's not even an option. And then option three really came about when someone said to me, and it was harsh at the time, but she was like, look, no one's coming to save you. And I thought, do you know what? She's right. No one is coming. He's not going to come back and say he's sorry. The people that I feel, this is my story, they've got a different perspective, that I felt had wronged me. They weren't coming back either. I've got to get out of this. Okay, how do I do that? Right, I've got to think really, really, really differently. I've got to
Mm.
kind of ditch all of that traditional old way of doing things. I've got to start looking at, completely new type of thinking, actually.
Mhm.
And that is when I just threw myself into learning how this fucking mind works. I'm like, I've got to make you my friend.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, you just seem to hate me.
Right.
And it's kind of like, I've had to do that because the thought, honestly, of being in that misery, I'd spent 40 years in misery. I'm like, I cannot do it. I just can't do it any longer. And that's when I started to understand about how our beliefs shape us, how our beliefs that we have about ourselves, about our world, whatever, really inform our actions.
Mhm.
And actually, the self loathing and self hatred was completely unnecessary. I'm not a terrible person, despite having been told that for many, many, many years. But actually, that is a load of crap. So that's when the magic started to happen, if you like. I
Yeah.
mean, it was hard work, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
really hard work.
Well, tell me about that. So, you knew you had to start thinking differently
Mhm.
because nobody was coming to save you. This is a place that so many people find themselves in. What did you even do? I mean, were you reading books? Were you wandering around online? What were even like your first 2 steps
Oh
into
God, I can't
thinking
even remember.
differently?
Yeah, I don't even know what the first 2 steps were, but I know I was definitely, like, Googling, loads
Okay.
of stuff, like,
Okay. Yep.
like, "What can I Google here?" And I started following some of law of attraction people, people like that, looking for more coaches.
Okay.
Then, because I'm like, "Therapy, is that right? No, I need something that's more forward thinking. Okay,
Yeah.
let's look at all these coaches." And I signed up to course after course after course. I remember, even though I had no money coming in at the time, I was just like, I paid like 3 grand for a course, which was, I was already a hypnotherapist, but it was an add-on to kind of that. And I was just like, I've just got to do this because I've got to change some stuff here.
Hi. We'll get back to the conversation in just a minute. We are about halfway through this examination of a midlife transition. But this podcast is about your midlife journey as much as it is about mine or Emily's. So let's make this conversation two-way. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own transition stories. What have you run across? How are you managing the onset of what I call the ick? Drop me a message on my website, thebig40.com, or find me on Instagram at thebig40. And I'll put those contact details in the show notes so you can just click right over. All right, back to the show.
And I bought books, and every single day I was on YouTube, I was listening to something. I cut out all things like the news and like anything that makes me feel bad. I just cut it right out. It's
Yep.
like, it doesn't matter. I only watched comedy for a long time. I'm like, I
Yep.
cannot watch anything that is
Yeah.
in the slightest bit going to make me feel bad.
Right. Because you're
Biggest,
trying to
hardest.
retrain yourself.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
you need to stay away from that for a
Yep.
while.
Yep.
Yeah.
I stayed off social media.
Yep.
That's
Okay.
like, even though we know it's not a true reflection of life, when you're in that space, when you feel so low, you kind of look at this stuff and you're like, oh my God, everyone's got an amazing life and I'm just not,
Right.
even though we
Yeah.
know it's bullshit. But the biggest piece, the biggest change piece for me was changing my internal dialogue.
Okay.
That was hard.
Yes.
And I was just like, I remember one day, like my neighbors must have thought, who is this woman? Because I just was screaming at the walls because I was like, right, you've got to change this internal dialogue. And every day I'm doing it, every checking in with what I'm saying. And then one day I was just like, reframe, reframe. I don't want to fucking reframe anything anymore. It was so loud.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically you were having yourself a tantrum,
Yes.
a
Yeah.
full on
Yep. Full
tantrum.
blown tantrum. Yeah.
Love it. I love it.
But it made me feel good afterwards, I'll tell you
I
that.
bet it did. I bet it did. You had been working so hard, you probably needed that release
Yeah.
to just be screaming. Oh my
Well, the
goodness.
neighbours just must have thought, "What the hell?"
Yeah.
Because, oh my god, I shouted. And then, you have that moment, don't you? You kind of, like, lick your wounds, and then you get
Yep.
back on the horse.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny, right? Because if we think of going to the gym or, like, getting in shape, like, there's a program out there that I ran across, I don't know, 15 years ago. It's called Couch to 5K,
Oh, yes,
right?
we have that
Right?
here. Yeah.
Everybody's heard of that, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, how do you go from being like a couch potato to running a race? And I just use that sort of as an example, right? But like, you got to get in shape and you have to start using new muscles and you have to build and you have to keep going, right? You're going to go to the gym, keep working out. And there comes a point where you're like, I'm exhausted. This is a big change. I have to cut myself a break. And so
Yeah.
you need to like pause and let what you've done integrate before you can keep going. So your
Yeah.
tantrum to me makes total sense because you had been working so hard and you were putting all yourself into it that like you just needed a moment to like ah a- and relax and then you could move forward again. Okay. So now you're working on retraining your brain. How long did that take for you?
I mean, I think I'm still working on it now, to be honest.
Of course, but there's
No, I
evidence in
know,
your
I
l
know.
yeah, there's evidence in your life that things have shifted.
Yes,
So
there
I'm
is.
curious, how long was this low period before you started climbing back up?
It was about a year actually, maybe less, because it took me a massively long time to shift the fundamental belief that I
Yep.
had failed because I hadn't got married. That for me was the biggest one, along with the codependency. Those were the two big things. It's funny because like my alcohol intake naturally declined, my eating naturally became quite normal, if you like, but I was still feeling this kind of thing about the relationship because it was my biggest nemesis, I suppose.
Yeah.
And alongside that, I did try to go for IVF, and then I got told that I was in early menopause. So I think there was a lot of hormonal stuff
Mhm.
around that as well at the same time. I mean, looking back, I probably went into menopause at about 38, 39. I think that, but because there was all this chaos going on, I just assumed it was all of that. So I think that played a big part. And but then I discovered HRT, and that was like a magic drug. so, so that definitely helped. It was a challenging time.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you started to come out of that and sort of stabilize and start moving forward, what kinds of things were shifting in your life? What did life start looking like for you?
So I knew that because I didn't have an income anymore, I'd given up my corporate career to help my partner build his business. I was like, okay, my back's against the wall. I need to really make business work. And I'd always had this idea. I'd had hypnotherapy clients on and off over the years, and I'd always had an idea of building that practice, but there'd always been an excuse.
Mhm.
Suddenly, when your back's against the wall, you've got to make it work. So I started my business and I now specialize in binge eating disorder and overeating because I lost my eyesight in my left eye when I was doing all the overeating. That was like a few years before, in my 30s. Anyway, so I started to build this practice and just everything had this knock-on effect. When you feel good from within, suddenly you attract much better people into your life. Suddenly you're earning more money because you know your value. Suddenly, you're not afraid. If I'd done something like this years ago with all that horrible mess in my head, I would have come off the call and I could have done an amazing call, but I would have thought to myself, oh my God, that's just useless, worthless. And that would have sent me into a downward spiral for days on end. But
Yeah.
now, I speak in the media, I'm on national TV, national radio, in fact, well, media across the world. And I actually did quite an awful interview once, actually about a year or so ago. And it was terrible because I wasn't prepped for the questions,
Yeah.
but it didn't send me into a downward spiral. And they asked me again, well, I don't know, 2 or 3 months later, and the old me would have just run away from that. And I was like, yeah, great. I'll do another interview on a slightly different subject. And it was brilliant.
Yeah.
So, all those things, it's just when you do that inner work, the headspace you've got is amazing and you can actually enjoy life. One of the biggest things for me, I remember I went to an event and I was just like, stood there going, my God, I'm enjoying this. This is weird. This is so weird because all the events that I've been to before, I'd have to get pissed, to enjoy
Yes.
because I didn't know that all this stuff was going on up here, all the anxiety, all the
Mm.
self-loathing, all the panic, all of that. I didn't realize that there was all of that stuff going on in my head every single day. And then suddenly I'm like, oh my God, I actually know what people mean when they say be in the moment. I was
Yeah.
like, because that was something that had always eluded me. I'm like, people go, "Oh, be in the moment." What the hell does that mean?
Right. Where else could I be?
Yeah, and I would just stand and, like, looking around going, "Okay, this is in the moment, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Don't." But this time, I went to that event and I was like, "My God, this is what being in the moment is. Wowzers, there's no chaos in my mind. I can just
Wow.
enjoy it."
Wow. No chaos in your mind. That's an amazing transformation from
Yep.
where you had been a few years earlier.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So how long has it been since all this went down?
So 8 years ago now, so yeah, I feel like should I have like a little badge, 8-year badge? And I know what you're gonna say, Steph, I don't look a day over 25, I know.
You don't. You don't. How could you be? And so life on the other side of this hard work that you did, right? You got knocked down and you finally realized that you need to do the hard work. You did the hard work. You've built yourself a business. You're finding you don't have the chaos in your mind. What does life look like on the other side?
Oh my god, it is amazing, It is so much better, not waking up every day hating yourself, just yeah, and even things like my riding, I think, is better because I'm not so flipping uptight.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think all stuff like that. The other side, I say this to my clients all the time, this is the hardest work you'll ever do, but the other side is so worth it. So, so worth it. Not to second guess everything, not to blame myself for everything, eh, and being able to speak up, speak out, be an adult. Actually, I was a child.
Yeah.
All of that stuff comes from childhood thinking. So my behavior in those relationships wasn't great either. Don't get me wrong, because I was
Right.
showing up as a child, wasn't
Yeah.
having adult conversations because I was too petrified that people were going to leave me,
Yeah.
and then when you've got two people that are both coming at it from a place of insecurity, it's always
Yeah.
going to blow up.
Yeah.
I definitely had a part to play in my entire life story.
Of
But at
course.
the time, I was just like, "Oh, I'm the victim."
Right.
But
Right.
actually, looking back, I attracted that stuff.
You weren't conscious of your part in everything that was going on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I did. I attracted it all.
Yeah, and the one thing that I love that you said that I think is such a signal of this growth is the fact that you had a terrible interview on TV and you went, "Wow, that sucked." But you went back, right? Like, you
Yeah.
didn't spend years beating yourself up over this performance, over that, right? You're human, and that was a human moment. And, whether it was as bad as you think it was or not, it's a human moment. And,
I mean, it was because my the girl that helps me with social media, she wouldn't put it on the website. So, I mean, it definitely was. It definitely was.
well, I'll tell you a little story then. Many, many years ago, hosting an event, I worked at a statewide business magazine, and I was emceeing a business event, and there was a panel discussion. And then I was supposed to moderate the live discussion. And so people had sent in questions. They'd written questions on little note cards and sent them, and somebody brought them up to me. And so I was flipping through them while somebody was coming up and asking a live question. So it was like trying to manage all these things. And so somebody's asking a live question, somebody's answering. I'm flipping through. I find a great question and I look up and I go, okay, here's this great question. And it was the same question that the person had just asked live. And I didn't even know it because I was so focused on finding the next great question. Oh, God, what a
Those
mess.
moments are just
And I
like,
was the only one in the room who didn't know the question had just been asked. Somebody had to go like, we just answered that." "Huh? What? Huh? Where was I?" I mean, it was yeah. So we all have those moments.
it's
We all
human. Yeah,
yeah.
we're human beings. But
Yeah.
I mean, in the moment, it is just like, oh God.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I can never show my face in this town again.
I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people who've done a lot worse.
Of course there is. But of course, these terribly embarrassing moments for ourselves, the fire that burns inside of us to tell us how terrible we are.
Yeah, it reinforces, the old me.
Yeah.
If that had happened, your scenario, my scenario, whatever, the old me would have been, "Oh my god, I'm this terrible person."
Right.
And actually, it's about not having those meanings on these events,
Right.
seeing
Not
things
using
from a
it
logical perspective rather than the emotional perspective that we
yeah,
we can so
not
often put
using
on
it
stuff.
as proof that you're a terrible person.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to somebody else on a podcast, and I was like, "You would have thought I'd like, done triple homicide with the way I used to be about myself, you know."
Yes. Yes.
Like, we think, "Oh, I'm terrible because I've eaten a packet of biscuits and drunk a bottle of wine." Ooh, whoop-de-doo.
Right. Right. The other thing that I was really struck by when we first spoke was that you were pretty confident that you had to go through all of that to get where you are today.
Yeah, yeah, I know, which seems a bit, I guess, kind of weird. Would I want to do it again? Absolutely bloody not. But I kind of feel like my life's purpose is to help other people. I lost the eyesight in my left eye. That has to be for a reason, right?
Yeah.
And now I help women who overeat, binge eat, and get rid of the stigma that it's their fault. I lost that eyesight and I still carried on with all of those behaviors because the pull is so much stronger until you go back and understand why you're doing this stuff, and until you start to reprogram your thinking, you will still go to those things. I remember I had a client once and she said, honestly, she said, I put food before my kids. And I get it, because the pull is so strong, it's so unconscious. And yet we're told that just stop eating and you'll be all right.
Right. Right.
If it was that easy, you know?
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
I kind of feel that the job that I do, it's not about the food actually. It's about you as a person, what you think and feel about yourself that then has a knock on effect with the food. And actually, I kind of feel like if I can do a 180 with my life, I'm no different to anybody else. I found it hard. If I can do that, then absolutely anyone can, but you've got to be shown how to do it.
Right.
It took me a long time to kind of figure this stuff out. but actually you can do it quite quickly if you know how to.
Yeah.
And I just don't want people to be in that pain,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
And
know?
it's tough. All these things, so many of these things are unconscious, as you said.
Yep.
And when they're unconscious, it's tough to find them. It's tough to know what they are. It's tough
Yep.
to realize how it is that you're being sabotaged by these thoughts you're not even aware of. That to me is always one of the real tricky parts is like how do you make the unconscious things that are sabotaging you, how do you make them conscious? How do you find them?
We're not taught this stuff early enough. I kind of feel that, growing up, if we were taught this stuff, my God, wouldn't life be different? Yeah, we'd still make some mistakes because that's life. But actually, you'd make the mistakes from a place of confidence, from a place of thinking you matter, from a place of value. When you think those things, the decisions you make are markedly different from when, the opposite is true.
Emily, I'm so happy that you were able to join me today. I'm thrilled to be here with you, and I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your story.
No, thank you. And thank you for telling me about your story because I'm going to remember that next time I do something embarrassing.
Yeah,
I'm like, well,
yeah.
Steph was human as well.
That's right, that's right, and you're welcome to tell anybody who needs to know, your clients, anybody who needs another story of stupid humanity that, I'm human too.
And I love your story, the whole 40 drinks thing, and I said to you earlier, before we jumped on here, that your emails are just so engaging. The whole thing you've done around this 40 drinks podcast is brilliant. Just this in itself is really helping people. It's amazing the work that you do.
Thank you so
Really is.
much, that really means the world to me. I appreciate your kind words so much.
No, you're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening today. Oh my goodness, compare and despair comes for us all at some point in time. Emily's pain and upset on her 40th birthday came from not achieving the life milestones that she thought she should have achieved by then. And societal and familial pressures play a profound role in shaping how we define success, especially in the first half of our lives. From the youngest of ages, so many of us internalize these expectations about what life should look like. Go to school, get a stable job, get married, buy a house, have some kids. We are so sure that this is the blueprint for happiness and fulfillment, and it's endlessly reinforced by media and cultural norms, if not by our family and friends, too. For people like Emily and even me, these expectations become so deeply ingrained, we don't even realize we have them. Let me give you my own example. I come from not one, but two huge families. My mom is one of six, and my dad is one of 10. And I always just assumed that I would have kids someday because that's just what I saw and just how you do it. On my mom's side, only one of the six siblings didn't have kids. And on my dad's side, four of the 10 siblings didn't have kids. And while that's almost half, there were so many kids around all the time. It just felt like that default option. So I remember clearly in my late 30s realizing that I didn't think I was going to have kids. It's actually one of the few good things to come out of a really not great relationship was that he had a couple of teenagers, and while we were dating, he told me he didn't want to have more kids. So that made me sit down and really think about how important that was for me. And that's when I realized it wasn't. So when I started dating my husband a couple of years later, he's a bunch of years younger than me. And we had some of those conversations about did we want kids? And I had told him kind of what I had come up with in the year or two prior to us meeting. And he asked me to just keep the door open for a little while, which I easily agreed to. But then we never did anything about it. So it's interesting that the assumption I had for all those years was kind of wrong. For Emily, when life didn't unfold according to that script that she had internalized, no marriage, no kids by the time she was 40. She found herself in a crisis of both identity and of self-worth. So it's really common around this time for people to start questioning whether these goals were ever truly their own. Did you pursue a career path, a relationship, or a lifestyle because you wanted it, or because you felt like you had to? I have talked to more than a handful of people who have pursued jobs and careers because their parents told them they would always have a good, well paying job, only to find themselves miserable when they woke up around this age. And many people realize the uncomfortable fact that achieving these external markers of success don't guarantee inner peace or happiness or fulfillment. Again, I have talked to more than a handful of people who have worked so hard, who have checked all the boxes only to achieve what was supposed to be the pinnacle, and then wake up and say, "Is this it? Is this all there is? Why aren't I happier?" So, for a lot of us, this time, sometime around age 40, is time to redefine success for ourselves and to explore paths that feel more authentic to us, not just the script that's been handed to us. This reflection is what moves many people into what Gail Sheehy calls second adulthood in her seminal book Passages, which I reference all the time. It's around this time that people become more attuned to their inner voice, and they start to value their own experiences over other people's opinions. And that sometimes leads to changing careers or ending relationships that no longer serve them, or embracing creative passions that you've suppressed because you didn't think there was room for them or time for them or they had value. In Emily's case, her breakdown led to a breakthrough. She rebuilt her life by focusing on self-worth and breaking free from the expectations that had weighed her down and made her so unhappy. And she focused really specifically on changing her internal dialogue, which is the other side of the coin of self-worth, since our beliefs and inner narratives can either trap us or liberate us. And I'm going to do a short bonus episode this week about self-worth and how to build it because it's important stuff, and I want to go a little deeper into it than we have time to here. So let's just say that Emily's story is a great example of how reevaluating life markers you're supposed to achieve can lead to personal growth. And for you, her story can maybe be a reminder that success doesn't have a single definition, and that midlife can be a time of transformation and freedom. So let me leave you just with a couple of questions today. If you took a moment to reflect on your life, could you identify any parts of it that you're living for someone else? Choices you've made, paths you've chosen that are based on someone else's opinions or prescription for your life. And then, which parts of your life are you living for yourself? And if there are some of each, can you identify which of those pieces fits or feels best and which are the most fulfilling to you? I would be really curious to hear your answers and to hear whether or not this leads you to any aha moments. So don't hesitate to drop me a line and let me know. All right. Next week, you are going to meet Marcy Langlois, who was 45 when she almost died of an autoimmune condition. While she had been managing a chronic illness her entire life, in 2021, Marcy fell sick with mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance. She was having allergic reactions to her own thoughts. Her body would go haywire whenever she started to think about the future. She was bedridden for 40 days, 3 of which she thought she was going to die. And when she finally figured out that her body was responding to her thoughts, she thought, if it was responding negatively to negative thoughts, what would happen if she chose peaceful thoughts instead? Tune in next week to find out the answer. The Big 4-0 podcast is produced and presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications.